Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates dreamed of prom dresses and college parties, she spent her evenings at the local gym, lifting weights and practicing combat moves her father had taught her. Her father, a retired Marine sergeant, had raised her alone after her mother died in a car accident when Sarah was just 8 years old. The tattoo on her left shoulder blade told a story that few people knew. It was an intricate design of a phoenix rising from flames with the words Semper Fi etched beneath it in bold letters. But this wasn't just any military tattoo. Hidden within the phoenix's wings were tiny symbols that only someone with extensive military knowledge would recognize. Symbols that marked her as someone special, someone who had earned respect through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Sarah's journey to this moment had begun 5 years earlier when she was just 18 years old. Fresh out of high school, she had walked into the Marine Corps recruitment office with determination burning in her eyes. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Johnson, had looked at the petite young woman standing before him and almost laughed. At 5 feet 4 inches and barely 120 pounds, Sarah didn't look like typical Marine material. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" Staff Sergeant Johnson had asked, his tone condescending. "The Marines isn't a place for pretty girls like you. Maybe you should consider the Air Force or Navy." Sarah's jaw had tightened at his words. She had placed both hands firmly on his desk and leaned forward. "Sir, with all due respect, I didn't come here to be underestimated. I came here to serve my country. My father served 20 years in the Corps, and I plan to follow in his footsteps." The recruiter had shrugged and handed her the paperwork. He figured she would wash out in the first week of boot camp like so many other idealistic young people who thought they were tougher than they actually were. Boot camp at Paris Island had been everything Sarah expected and more. The drill instructors had singled her out from day one, convinced that the small-town girl would break under pressure. They made her carry extra weight during marches, assigned her additional duties, and pushed her harder than any other recruit in her platoon. But Sarah had thrived under the pressure. Every insult, every challenge, every moment of doubt had only fueled her determination. She had finished boot camp as the honor graduate of her platoon, earning the respect of the same drill instructors who had tried to break her spirit. Her success hadn't stopped there. Sarah had volunteered for every difficult assignment, every dangerous mission, every opportunity to prove herself. She had completed advanced combat training, earned her expert marksman badge, and qualified for special operations training. Each achievement had been hard-won, earned through countless hours of training and an unshakable belief in herself. The specialized training had been the most challenging experience of her life. For 6 months, she had endured physical and mental trials that pushed her to the absolute limits of human endurance. She had learned skills that most people couldn't imagine: advanced hand-to-hand combat, psychological warfare tactics, survival techniques, and intelligence-gathering methods. Only 12 people out of her original class of 50 had successfully completed the program. Sarah had not only finished, but she had graduated second in her class. The tattoo she received upon completion was more than just ink on skin. It was a symbol of membership in an elite group of warriors, a mark that identified her as someone who had proven herself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. For 3 years, Sarah had served in classified operations around the world. She had seen combat in places that didn't officially exist on any military maps. She had saved lives, gathered crucial intelligence, and completed missions that had prevented international incidents from escalating into full-scale wars. But everything had changed 6 months ago, during a mission that had gone terribly wrong. Sarah's unit had been ambushed while conducting a rescue operation in a hostile territory. In the chaos that followed, she had made a split-second decision that had saved the lives of her teammates but had resulted in her being captured by enemy forces. For 3 weeks, she had endured interrogation and torture, refusing to reveal any classified information, despite the physical and psychological abuse she suffered. Her captors had tried everything: beatings, sleep deprivation, psychological manipulation. But Sarah had remained silent, protecting the secrets that could have compromised national security. Her rescue had come in the form of a joint operation between multiple Special Forces units. When they finally reached her, Sarah had been barely conscious, her body bearing the marks of her ordeal, but her spirit remained unbroken, and the first words she spoke to her rescuers were not about her own condition, but about the intelligence she had gathered about her captors' operations. The physical wounds had healed relatively quickly, But the psychological impact had been more challenging to overcome. Sarah had developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and panic attacks that made it impossible for her to continue her active duty service. The military doctors had recommended medical discharge, suggesting that she take time to heal and consider a civilian career. But Sarah couldn't accept the idea of leaving the Marines. The Corps wasn't just her job. It was her identity, her purpose, her family. After months of therapy and rehabilitation, Sarah had been cleared for limited duty. She had been assigned to a training facility where she could use her experience to prepare new recruits for the challenges they would face in the field. It wasn't the same as active combat duty, but it was a way for her to continue serving while managing her condition. Today was supposed to be just another routine day at the training facility. Sarah had been tasked with conducting a combat readiness assessment for a group of 180 soldiers from various units who were preparing for deployment. She had done similar assessments dozens of times before, always wearing her dress uniform to establish her authority and credibility. But this morning, everything had gone wrong. A water pipe had burst in her quarters, soaking all of her uniforms and leaving her with nothing appropriate to wear for the formal assessment. With no time to find a replacement uniform and 180 soldiers waiting for her evaluation, Sarah had made the difficult decision to conduct the assessment in civilian clothes. As she walked toward the training facility, Sarah knew that this day would test her in ways she hadn't experienced since her capture. She would have to prove herself all over again, this time without the visual symbols of rank and authority that her uniform provided. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training facility as Sarah approached the main building. She wore simple black jeans, combat boots, and a fitted gray t-shirt, civilian clothes that revealed nothing about her military background or qualifications. In her hands, she carried a folder containing the assessment protocols and a clipboard with the names of the 180 soldiers she was supposed to evaluate. As she entered the building, Sarah could hear the loud chatter and laughter coming from the main assembly hall. The sound grew quieter as she pushed open the heavy doors and stepped inside. 180 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and the conversation died completely. The soldiers were arranged in neat rows, all wearing their crisp dress uniforms with ribbons and rank insignia clearly displayed. They represented various branches of the military: Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, and ranged in rank from privates to staff sergeants. Most of them were young men in their early 20s, though there were several women and older NCOs scattered throughout the group. Sarah walked to the front of the room, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. She could feel the weight of their stares, could sense the confusion and skepticism radiating from the assembled soldiers. She had expected this reaction, but it still stung to see the doubt in their eyes. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the large room. "I'm here to conduct your pre-deployment combat readiness assessment." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Sarah heard fragments of whispered conversations. "Who is she? Where's her uniform? Is this some kind of joke?" In the third row, a tall Army sergeant named Mike Thompson leaned over to his buddy and whispered, "They sent some civilian chick to evaluate us. What's next, my little sister, giving us marksmanship tips?" The soldier next to him, Corporal James Rodriguez, shook his head in disbelief. "This has got to be a mistake. Maybe she's just here to take attendance or something." Near the back of the room, Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen, one of the few women in the group, felt a mix of embarrassment and anger on Sarah's behalf. She had experienced similar skepticism throughout her own career and recognized the challenging position the young woman was in. Sarah cleared her throat and continued, "I understand that my appearance may have caught some of you off guard. I'm not wearing a uniform today due to circumstances beyond my control. However, I can assure you that I am fully qualified to conduct this assessment." A hand shot up in the middle of the room. It belonged to Sergeant First Class David Walker, a stocky man with 15 years of Army experience. "Ma'am, with all due respect, could we see some identification? We were expecting a military instructor, not—" He paused, searching for diplomatic words. "Not someone in civilian clothes." Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out her military ID card. She held it up for the room to see, though she knew that from their distance they couldn't make out the details. "My name is Sarah Martinez, and I am a United States Marine," she said firmly. "I have been assigned to conduct your assessment, and that's exactly what I intend to do." The skepticism in the room was palpable. Several soldiers exchanged glances that clearly conveyed their doubts about her qualifications. The lack of visible rank insignia or ribbons made it impossible for them to gauge her experience or authority. Petty Officer Second Class Kevin O'Brien, a Navy sailor with a reputation for speaking his mind, raised his hand. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but could you tell us about your background? Most of us have been in service for several years, and we're curious about what qualifies you to evaluate our readiness for deployment." Sarah had anticipated this question, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. In her uniform, her ribbons and insignia would have spoken for themselves. The Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, and numerous other decorations would have immediately established her credibility. Without those visual indicators, she was just a young woman in civilian clothes making claims about her military service. "That's a fair question," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure despite the challenging situation. "I served for 5 years in active duty, including multiple combat deployments. I have experience in various combat environments and specialized training that qualifies me to assess your readiness for the challenges you'll face in the field." Her response was truthful but necessarily vague. The classified nature of many of her missions made it impossible to provide specific details about her service record. From the front row, Lieutenant Marcus Johnson, a young Marine officer fresh out of Quantico, spoke up with barely concealed condescension. "Ma'am, I don't mean to question your service, but most of us here have combat experience ourselves. Some of these NCOs have been deployed multiple times. It seems unusual for someone so young to be conducting our assessment, especially without wearing the uniform." The implication was clear. They didn't believe she had the experience or authority to evaluate seasoned soldiers. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting angry or defensive would only reinforce their doubts about her professionalism. "I understand your concerns," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the frustration building inside her. "However, I've been assigned this task by command, and I intend to complete it. We can discuss my qualifications further if needed, but right now we have work to do." The soldiers continued to exchange skeptical looks. Sarah could see the doubt written plainly on their faces. Some were shaking their heads slightly. Others were whispering to their neighbors. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from curiosity to outright disbelief. Staff Sergeant Chen felt uncomfortable watching the scene unfold. She knew how difficult it was for women in the military to gain respect, especially when they looked as young as Sarah did. She wanted to speak up in support, but she also didn't want to make the situation worse by appearing to question the male soldier's judgment. Sergeant Thompson turned to Rodriguez again and whispered more loudly this time, "I bet she's never even been outside the wire. Probably some desk jockey they pulled from headquarters." His comment was overheard by several other soldiers who nodded in agreement. The murmur of conversation grew louder as more soldiers began expressing their doubts about Sarah's qualifications. Sarah raised her voice slightly to regain their attention. "Gentlemen and ladies, I can see that you have concerns about this situation. I respect that you're questioning my authority. That shows you take your responsibilities seriously. But I need you to understand that this assessment will proceed as scheduled, regardless of what I'm wearing or how old I appear to be." The room fell silent again, but the tension was thick. Sarah could feel the challenge in their collective gaze. These were experienced soldiers who had earned their place through years of service and sacrifice. They weren't going to simply accept her authority without proof that she deserved it. Sarah realized that this moment would define not just the assessment, but her credibility as an instructor going forward. She had two choices. She could try to muscle through the situation using her assigned authority, or she could find a way to earn their respect on their terms. The first option might get her through the day, but the second option would determine whether she could effectively serve in her new role. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to assert her authority through rank or paperwork, she would let her knowledge and experience speak for themselves. She set down her clipboard and stepped closer to the assembled soldiers. "I can see that you're not convinced," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of confidence. "And honestly, I don't blame you. If I were in your position, I'd have the same questions. So let me tell you what this assessment is really about, and why your lives might depend on taking it seriously." The room grew quieter as soldiers leaned forward, intrigued by the shift in her tone. "How many of you have been in a firefight that lasted more than 6 hours?" Sarah asked, scanning the room. About 30 hands went up, mostly belonging to the more experienced NCOs. How many of you have had to perform field surgery on a teammate while under enemy fire? This time, only 5 hands rose. How many of you have been captured by enemy forces? The room fell completely silent. Not a single hand was raised. Sarah nodded grimly. That's what I thought. Most of you have combat experience, and that's valuable. But combat experience and survival experience are 2 different things. This assessment isn't about whether you can shoot straight or follow orders. It's about whether you can survive when everything goes wrong, when your plans fall apart, and when you're on your own in hostile territory. She began walking among the rows of soldiers as she spoke, making eye contact with individuals as she passed. "Sergeant Thompson," she said, stopping in front of the soldier who had been making disparaging comments. "You've been deployed 3 times to Afghanistan, correct?" Thompson looked surprised that she knew his service record. "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me about your worst day over there." Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ma'am, we were on patrol in Helmand Province when our convoy hit an IED. Lost 2 vehicles, had 3 wounded. Took us 4 hours to get them evacuated." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "That sounds like a terrible day. I'm sorry for your losses. But let me ask you this. During those 4 hours, did you have radio contact with your base?" "Most of the time, yes, ma'am." "Did you have air support available?" "Yes, ma'am." Apache helicopters provided cover during the evacuation. So even on your worst day, you had backup, communication, and medical evacuation available. That's exactly how it should be when you're operating with proper support. Sarah's voice remained respectful but pointed. "But what happens when you don't have any of that?" She moved to another soldier, Corporal Martinez, who had served 2 tours in Iraq. "Corporal, what's the longest you've gone without resupply in the field?" 5 days, ma'am. We were at a remote outpost and weather grounded the supply choppers." 5 days, Sarah repeated. "That's significant. But you had shelter, you had your unit for security, and you knew help was coming. What would you do if you were alone, injured, with no communication, no shelter, and no idea if anyone was looking for you?" The questions were making the soldiers uncomfortable, but they were also making them think. These weren't theoretical scenarios to Sarah. Her tone and the specificity of her questions suggested she was speaking from experience. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a Marine with 8 years of service, raised his hand. "Ma'am, are you talking about SEER training scenarios?" Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room. "SEER training is a good start, Sergeant. Survival, evasion, resistance, escape, valuable skills. But SEER training is conducted in controlled environments with safety protocols and instructors nearby. What I'm talking about is when those skills are your only option for staying alive." She walked to the front of the room and turned to face the group again. "Let me paint you a picture. You're on a mission in hostile territory. Your helicopter goes down due to mechanical failure. You're injured, not critically, but enough to slow you down. Your radio is destroyed in the crash. You're 50 miles from the nearest friendly forces, and you know enemy patrols are searching for survivors." The room was completely quiet now. Every soldier was hanging on her words. You have whatever supplies you can salvage from the wreckage, whatever's in your personal kit, and your training. That's it. No air support, no backup, no cavalry coming to save you. Just you, your skills, and your will to survive. Sarah's voice grew more intense as she continued. "Do you know how to treat a sucking chest wound using only materials you can find in nature? Can you build a shelter that will keep you alive in sub-zero temperatures without alerting enemy forces to your location? Do you know how to navigate 50 miles through enemy territory while avoiding patrols, electronic surveillance, and local informants?" The soldiers were exchanging glances again, but this time the looks were different. Instead of skepticism, there was growing recognition that this young woman was describing scenarios with an uncomfortable level of detail and realism. Lieutenant Johnson, the young Marine officer who had questioned her earlier, raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, how do you know so much about survival situations?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because I've lived through them, Lieutenant. The scenarios I'm describing aren't hypothetical to me, they're memories." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Suddenly, her civilian clothes and youthful appearance seemed less important than the knowledge and experience she was demonstrating. Petty Officer O'Brien, who had questioned her qualifications earlier, spoke up again. "Ma'am, what unit were you with?" Sarah hesitated. Much of her service record was classified, and she couldn't provide specific unit information without violating security protocols. I can't discuss specific units or missions, Petty Officer, but I can tell you that I served in several theaters of operation, and my training included specialized survival and evasion techniques. The vague answer frustrated some of the soldiers, but others were beginning to understand that her reluctance to provide details might actually support her credibility rather than undermine it. Sergeant First Class Walker, the Army NCO who had initially challenged her, leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. Ma'am, you're talking about situations that most of us have never faced. Are these the kinds of scenarios we might encounter on our deployment? That depends on where you're going and what your mission is, Sarah replied. But the reality is that modern warfare is unpredictable. You might start a mission with full support and find yourself isolated and on your own within hours. Equipment fails, communications get jammed, weather changes plans, and enemies adapt to your tactics. She paused, looking around the room at the 180 faces staring back at her. The purpose of this assessment isn't to teach you everything you need to know about survival. It's to identify gaps in your knowledge and skills so that you can address them before you deploy. Because if you wait until you're in the field to discover what you don't know, it might be too late. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. What had started as skepticism was evolving into genuine interest and respect. Sarah could see it in their posture, in the way they leaned forward when she spoke, in the quality of their questions. But she also sensed that some of the more experienced soldiers were still reserving judgment. Staff Sergeant Chen decided to test Sarah's knowledge with a more specific question. Ma'am, you mentioned treating wounds with natural materials. Can you give us an example of how that would work in practice? Sarah nodded, appreciating the direct challenge. Absolutely. Let's say you have a deep laceration on your arm, maybe from shrapnel or a fall onto sharp rocks. You need to stop the bleeding, prevent infection, and create a dressing that will hold up while you're moving through rough terrain. She walked over to one of the soldiers in the front row. May I borrow your belt, Corporal? The young Marine looked confused but handed over his belt. Sarah also picked up a water bottle from a nearby table and asked another soldier for his field knife. First, you need to create pressure to stop the bleeding. If you don't have medical supplies, you can use strips of cloth from your uniform. But you need something to maintain consistent pressure. She demonstrated by wrapping the belt around her own arm. The belt creates a tourniquet effect, but you have to be careful not to cut off circulation completely. Several soldiers were taking notes now, recognizing practical information they could use. For cleaning the wound, clean water is ideal, but if you don't have it, you can use your own urine. I know that sounds disgusting, but urine is sterile when it leaves your body. And it's better than nothing if you're dealing with a dirty wound. A few soldiers grimaced, but they were paying attention. For preventing infection, you look for natural antiseptics. Honey is excellent if you can find wild beehives, but that's rare in most combat environments. More commonly, you can find plants like willow bark or certain types of moss that have antimicrobial properties. Sarah handed the belt back to the corporal and continued. For the actual dressing, you need something that will absorb blood but won't stick to the wound. Spider webs, believe it or not, are excellent for this. They're naturally antimicrobial and help with clotting. You can also use the inner bark of certain trees, or even sphagnum moss if you're in the right environment. The level of detail in her explanation was impressive, but it was the casual way she discussed these techniques that really caught their attention. She wasn't reciting from a manual. She was speaking from experience. Sergeant Thompson, who had been one of her harshest critics, raised his hand. Ma'am, that's good information, but how do you know it actually works? Have you used these techniques in real situations? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Yes, Sergeant. I have. The simple honesty of her answer carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Something in her tone told the soldiers that she wasn't boasting or trying to impress them. She was simply stating a fact. Colonel James Patterson, the base commander, had been standing quietly in the back of the room for the past 10 minutes. He had come to check on the assessment after receiving reports about the unusual situation with the instructor's civilian clothes. What he found was far more interesting than he had expected. Patterson was a veteran of 3 combat deployments and had seen plenty of instructors over the years. Most of them fell into 2 categories: academic types who knew theory but had never applied it, or combat veterans who could tell war stories but couldn't effectively transfer knowledge to others. Sarah seemed to be something different, someone who combined extensive practical experience with the ability to teach complex concepts clearly. Lieutenant Johnson raised his hand again. Ma'am, what about navigation without GPS or compass? A lot of us have become pretty dependent on technology for that. Good question, Sarah replied. Natural navigation is a skill that's been almost lost in the modern military. But when your equipment fails, it becomes critical. She walked to the windows on the east side of the room. First, you use the sun. Everyone knows the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but most people don't know how to use that information precisely. The sun's position changes throughout the day in predictable ways, and if you know the time, you can determine direction fairly accurately. She pointed out the window. Right now, it's about 9 a.m. and the sun is in that direction. That tells us that's roughly southeast. At noon, the sun will be due south, and by evening it will be in the southwest. Several soldiers were looking out the windows trying to follow her explanation. At night, you use the stars. Everyone's heard of the North Star, but finding it isn't as easy as people think. You need to find the Big Dipper first, then use the pointer stars to locate Polaris. But what do you do when it's cloudy? She paused, letting them think about the question. You use terrain features, wind patterns, and vegetation. Water flows downhill, so streams and rivers can tell you about elevation and direction. Snow melts differently on north-facing versus south-facing slopes. Moss doesn't actually grow on the north side of trees like people think, but vegetation patterns can still give you clues about direction if you know what to look for. The questions kept coming, and Sarah answered each one with the same combination of theoretical knowledge and practical experience. She discussed water purification techniques, shelter construction, food procurement, and signal methods. Each answer revealed another layer of expertise that would have been impossible to fake. Corporal Martinez asked about escape and evasion techniques. Ma'am, what do you do if you're being tracked by enemy forces? Sarah's expression grew more serious. Evasion is as much about psychology as it is about physical techniques. Most people think it's about moving fast and hiding, but actually, it's about thinking like your pursuers and staying one step ahead of them. She began describing techniques for breaking trail, using terrain to mask movement and creating false signs to mislead trackers. Her knowledge was detailed and specific, covering everything from how to cross streams without leaving tracks to how to use urban environments for concealment. The key is understanding how trained trackers think, she explained. They look for patterns, disturbed vegetation, soil compression, fabric caught on branches. If you know what they're looking for, you can avoid leaving those signs or even create false trails to lead them away from your actual route. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez interrupted with a sharp question. Ma'am, what about interrogation resistance? What do you do if you get captured? The room fell completely silent. This was the question that separated theoretical knowledge from real experience. Every soldier knew the basics from their training. But the way Sarah had been discussing survival scenarios suggested she might have more than theoretical knowledge about this topic as well. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time since she had started teaching, she looked uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before. Interrogation resistance is the most difficult skill I can discuss with you, because it's impossible to truly prepare someone for the psychological pressure of captivity. The techniques you learn in training are valuable, but they're just the foundation. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. The most important thing to understand is that everyone breaks eventually. The goal isn't to never give up information. It's to hold out long enough for that information to become useless, or for rescue to arrive. The silence in the room was profound. Sarah's last statement about interrogation resistance had hit the soldiers like a physical blow. The casual way she had said, "Everyone breaks eventually," carried implications that made them deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't textbook knowledge. This was the voice of someone who had lived through something most of them couldn't imagine. Colonel Patterson stepped forward from the back of the room. His movement caught everyone's attention, and the soldiers quickly stood at attention when they recognized his rank. "As you were," Patterson said quietly, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Continue with your instruction." Sarah nodded to the colonel, grateful for his support but aware that his presence had added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. She could see the soldiers looking back and forth between her and Patterson, trying to read the dynamic between them. The psychological techniques used in interrogation are designed to break down your sense of identity and reality. Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the difficulty of the subject. Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation. Temperature extremes and psychological pressure are all tools designed to make you vulnerable. She walked slowly among the soldiers as she spoke, her tone becoming more instructional and less personal. The military teaches you to give only name, rank, service number, and date of birth. That's correct, but it's incomplete. In reality, you need strategies for managing the psychological pressure, techniques for maintaining mental clarity under extreme stress, and methods for protecting the most critical information even when you're forced to give up some details. Sergeant First Class Walker raised his hand. Ma'am, what kind of strategies are you talking about? Sarah considered the question carefully. Mental compartmentalization is crucial. You create different levels of information in your mind, things you can safely reveal to protect more important secrets, personal memories that help you maintain your identity, and core values that can't be compromised no matter what. She stopped walking and faced the group directly. But I want to be very clear about something. The scenarios I'm describing are extreme situations that most of you will never face. The purpose of discussing them isn't to frighten you, but to prepare you for the possibility and to help you understand why the skills we're assessing today could save your life. Lieutenant Johnson had been listening intently, and something in Sarah's manner had convinced him that she was speaking from authority rather than theory. Ma'am, what unit provides training for these kinds of situations? Sarah glanced at Colonel Patterson before answering. There are several specialized programs that provide advanced survival and resistance training. The specific units and programs are often classified, which is why I can't provide details about my own background. The colonel stepped forward slightly. I can confirm that this instructor has the proper credentials and authorization to conduct this assessment. Her background has been thoroughly vetted by command. His words carried significant weight with the soldiers. If the base commander was vouching for her, that meant her qualifications were legitimate. Regardless of what she was wearing or how young she looked, Staff Sergeant Chen decided to test Sarah's knowledge from a different angle. Ma'am, what about the psychological aspects of survival? How do you maintain mental stability during extended isolation? That's an excellent question, Sarah replied, seeming more comfortable with this topic. Physical survival skills are only part of the equation. Mental resilience is often what determines whether someone lives or dies in extreme situations. She began describing techniques for managing fear, maintaining hope, and preserving sanity during long periods of stress and isolation. Her knowledge was detailed and specific, covering everything from meditation techniques to methods for tracking time without a watch. One of the most dangerous enemies in a survival situation is despair, she explained. When people lose hope, they stop taking care of themselves. They make poor decisions, and they give up on opportunities for rescue or escape. The soldiers were taking notes more actively now, recognizing valuable information they hadn't received in their standard training. You maintain mental stability by creating routines, setting small achievable goals, and focusing on immediate tasks rather than the overwhelming nature of your overall situation. You break down survival into manageable pieces. Get through the next hour, find water for today, build shelter before dark. Corporal Martinez asked about dealing with injuries in isolation. Ma'am, what if you're seriously injured and there's no possibility of medical help? Sarah's answer was unflinchingly practical. You do whatever you can with whatever you have, and you accept that survival might require making difficult choices about your own body. Sometimes you have to choose between saving a limb and saving your life. The graphic nature of her response made some soldiers uncomfortable, but it also reinforced their growing belief that she was speaking from experience rather than theory. Petty Officer O'Brien raised his hand again.
Ma'am, I have to ask, how do we know this information is current?
Military tactics and enemy capabilities change constantly. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. That's why this assessment includes current threat briefings and updated survival techniques. The fundamentals don't change much. People still need water, shelter, and security, but the specific challenges evolve with technology and tactics. She walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room and began sketching a diagram. Modern enemy forces use different tracking methods than they did 10 years ago. Electronic surveillance, thermal imaging, and drone technology have all changed the game for evasion. The diagram showed overlapping fields of surveillance coverage and methods for avoiding detection. Her knowledge of current enemy capabilities was impressive and detailed. The good news is that technology also provides new opportunities for survival and communication. GPS devices, Satellite communicators and solar chargers can be lifesavers if you know how to use them properly and protect them from damage. As she continued teaching, Sarah gradually removed her gray t-shirt, revealing a black tank top underneath. The movement was casual and practical. The room was getting warm, and she needed more freedom of movement to demonstrate some of the techniques she was describing. But the simple action also revealed something that changed everything in the room. On her left shoulder blade, clearly visible through the thin fabric of her tank top, was the outline of an intricate tattoo. Most of the soldiers couldn't make out the details from their distance, but several of the more experienced NCOs could see enough to recognize military-style ink. Colonel Patterson's eyes widened slightly as he caught sight of the tattoo. From his position at the back of the room, he couldn't see all the details, but he could make out enough to realize that Sarah's background might be even more significant than he had assumed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who was sitting in the front row, had the best view of the tattoo. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The design was clearly a phoenix rising from flames, but it was the details around the edges that made his heart race. He could see symbols and markings that he recognized from his own military service, symbols that indicated specialized training and elite unit affiliation. Sarah continued teaching, unaware that her tattoo had been noticed. She was demonstrating hand-to-hand combat techniques, showing the soldiers how to defend themselves if they were captured, and their captors tried to move them to a secondary location. The most important thing to remember is that your chances of survival decrease dramatically if you allow yourself to be moved to a secondary location, she explained while demonstrating a defensive technique. Whatever the risk of resisting at the initial capture point, it's usually better than the risk of being moved somewhere more secure. Her movements were fluid and precise, showing the kind of muscle memory that comes only from extensive training and real-world application. The soldiers watched in fascination as this small woman demonstrated techniques that could disable much larger opponents. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez couldn't take his eyes off the tattoo. As Sarah moved through her demonstrations, more details became visible. He could see the Semper Fi inscription beneath the phoenix, but it was the smaller symbols around the edges that made his pulse quicken. Those weren't standard Marine Corps tattoos. They were indicators of something much more exclusive. Rodriguez had served with special operations units during his 8-year career, and he recognized the markings. The small trident, partially hidden in the phoenix's left wing, was associated with maritime special operations. The crossed arrows near the tail suggested advanced reconnaissance training. Most significantly, the tiny number 17 embedded in the flames was something he had only seen once before, on the shoulder of an operator who had refused to discuss what it meant. As Sarah continued her instruction, Rodriguez found himself studying her movements with new eyes. The way she demonstrated combat techniques wasn't just technically correct. It showed the kind of unconscious competence that came from using these skills in life-or-death situations. Her footwork, her balance, her awareness of her surroundings all suggested someone who had been trained to a level far beyond standard military instruction. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said, noticing his intense attention, "would you like to volunteer for a demonstration?" Rodriguez nodded and stood up, his mind racing. This was his opportunity to test his suspicions about her background. "Ma'am, could you show us how to escape from a restraint hold?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah gestured for him to approach. "Certainly. Sergeant, please grab my wrists as if you were restraining me." Rodriguez moved behind her and grasped both of her wrists, applying the kind of firm grip that would be used to control a prisoner. What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds, but it was enough to confirm everything he had suspected. Sarah's escape was not the simple technique that would be taught in basic self-defense courses. Instead, she executed a complex sequence of movements that used leverage, misdirection, and precise strikes to vulnerable points. Before Rodriguez realized what was happening, he found himself on the ground with Sarah's foot positioned near his throat, not making contact, but positioned to show that she could have inflicted serious damage if she had chosen to. "The key," Sarah said calmly, helping Rodriguez back to his feet, "is to act before your captor expects resistance, and to target points where even a small person can generate significant leverage against a larger opponent." Rodriguez dusted himself off, his respect for Sarah now complete. "Thank you, ma'am. That was very educational. But his eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that brief exchange, Sarah realized that he had recognized something in her tattoo or her movements. She could see the understanding in his expression, and she knew that her cover was beginning to slip. Colonel Patterson had also been watching the demonstration with great interest. Sarah's technique was far more advanced than anything taught in standard military training. Combined with what he could see of her tattoo and her extensive knowledge of specialized survival techniques, he was beginning to piece together a picture of her background that was far more significant than her personnel file had indicated. The demonstration had also caught the attention of the other soldiers. They had gone from skepticism to interest to respect, and now they were looking at Sarah with something approaching awe. The casual efficiency with which she had neutralized a much larger opponent had shattered any remaining doubts about her qualifications. Sergeant Thompson, who had been one of her earliest critics, raised his hand with a sheepish expression. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. When you first walked in here, I thought this was going to be a waste of time. But you clearly know what you're talking about." Sarah smiled at him. "No apology necessary, Sergeant. Healthy skepticism is a good thing in the military. You should question anyone who claims authority, especially when they show up in civilian clothes." Her gracious response to his criticism only increased the soldiers' respect for her. They were beginning to understand that her confidence wasn't arrogance, it was the quiet assurance of someone who had proven herself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Lieutenant," Johnson stood up from his seat. "Ma'am, I have a question that's been bothering me. You've been teaching us about survival in hostile territory, but you've also mentioned interrogation resistance and escape techniques. These aren't typical subjects for a standard combat readiness assessment. What kind of deployment are we preparing for?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah glanced at Colonel Patterson, who gave her a barely perceptible nod. "That's classified information, Lieutenant," Sarah replied. "But I can tell you that your unit has been selected for a mission that will require skills beyond standard combat operations. The assessment we're conducting today will help determine your readiness for those additional challenges." The implications of her words sent a ripple of excitement and nervousness through the assembled soldiers. They had known their deployment would be dangerous, but they were beginning to understand that it might be something more specialized than they had expected. Staff Sergeant Chen raised her hand. "Ma'am, are you going to be deploying with us?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "That hasn't been determined yet. My role is currently limited to training and assessment." But even as she said it, Sarah felt a familiar longing. Despite her PTSD and the trauma she had endured, part of her missed the intensity and purpose of active duty. Teaching was important work, but it couldn't completely fill the void left by her transition away from operational service. Corporal Martinez asked the question that several soldiers had been thinking. "Ma'am, what happened to your uniform? You mentioned circumstances beyond your control." Sarah's expression grew slightly uncomfortable. "A water pipe burst in my quarters early this morning, soaking all of my dress uniforms. I didn't have time to find a replacement before this assessment." The explanation was simple and believable, but it also reminded the soldiers of how much they had misjudged her based on her appearance. They had been so focused on what she was wearing that they had nearly missed the opportunity to learn from someone with extraordinary knowledge and experience. Petty Officer O'Brien spoke up again. "Ma'am, I think I speak for everyone when I say that this has been the most valuable training session we've had. Your clothes don't matter, your knowledge does." There was a murmur of agreement from around the room. The 180 soldiers who had started the day skeptical and dismissive were now hanging on every word Sarah said. But Sarah could sense that the dynamic in the room was building toward something. The soldiers' respect had evolved into curiosity about her background, and she could see several of them studying her tattoo whenever she turned around. Rodriguez in particular kept looking at her with an expression that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "I appreciate your attention and professionalism," Sarah said. "Now let's move on to the practical portion of the assessment. I want to test your knowledge of the concepts we've discussed." She began outlining a series of scenario-based tests that would evaluate their survival skills, decision-making abilities, and psychological resilience. But even as she spoke, Sarah was aware that the soldiers' questions about her background were becoming more pointed and more difficult to deflect. Colonel Patterson approached her during a brief break between exercises. "Instructor Martinez," he said quietly, I think it might be time to provide these soldiers with some additional context about your qualifications. Sarah looked at him with concern. Sir, much of my background is classified. I understand, Patterson replied. But these soldiers have earned the right to know who's teaching them. They're going into harm's way based on your instruction, and they deserve to understand why they should trust you. Sarah nodded slowly, understanding his point but dreading what came next. Once she revealed more about her background, there would be no going back to the relative anonymity she had been enjoying in her training role. Sarah stood at the front of the room, looking out at the 180 faces that had transformed from skeptical to respectful over the course of the morning. She could feel the weight of their expectation, their growing curiosity about her background, and their need to understand who she really was. The moment Colonel Patterson had suggested had arrived. It was time to reveal the truth about her service. Before we continue with the practical assessments, Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt. Colonel Patterson has suggested that you deserve to know more about my background and qualifications. The room fell completely silent. Every soldier leaned forward in anticipation. Sarah turned around slowly, presenting her back to the assembled group. The tattoo on her left shoulder blade was now fully visible through her tank top. She could hear several sharp intakes of breath as the soldiers got their first clear look at the intricate design. This tattoo tells the story of my service better than any words I could speak, she said, still facing away from them. The phoenix represents rebirth and resilience, the ability to rise from destruction stronger than before. The flames represent the trials that test every warrior's resolve. She turned back to face them and her expression had changed. The professional instructor's mask had been replaced by something more vulnerable but also more powerful. The Semper Fi inscription identifies me as a Marine, but the other symbols tell a different story. The trident represents maritime special operations. The crossed arrows indicate advanced reconnaissance training. The number 17 embedded in the flames. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Let's just say it represents a level of specialization that fewer than 50 people have achieved in the past decade. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez felt his suspicions confirmed. The number 17 was associated with the most classified special operations programs, the kind that officially didn't exist. 5 months ago, Sarah continued, I was serving with a unit whose name and mission I still cannot reveal. During a classified operation, my team was compromised. I was captured by enemy forces and held for 3 weeks before being rescued. The silence in the room was profound. Several soldiers had stopped taking notes and were simply staring at her in shock. During those 3 weeks, I experienced everything I've been teaching you about today. Interrogation, psychological pressure, physical abuse, and the constant challenge of maintaining hope when survival seemed impossible. Her voice remained steady, but the soldiers could see the cost of these memories in her eyes. The techniques I've shared with you for treating wounds, finding water, building shelter, resisting interrogation, I didn't learn these from textbooks or controlled training exercises. I learned them because my life depended on them. Lieutenant Johnson's hand went up tentatively. Ma'am, how did you survive 3 weeks of captivity? Sarah met his gaze directly. By using every technique I've taught you today, and by refusing to give up hope. My captors tried everything. Physical torture, psychological manipulation, threats against my family. But I remembered my training. I compartmentalized the information they wanted, and I held on to the belief that my team would come for me. She walked closer to the front row of soldiers. The rescue operation that freed me resulted in the deaths of 2 enemy combatants and one of my rescuers. A good man died getting me out of that place. That's why I can't treat this instruction as an academic exercise. The skills we're discussing might be the difference between life and death for some of you. Colonel Patterson stepped forward. What Instructor Martinez isn't telling you is that during her captivity, she gathered intelligence that prevented a major terrorist attack on U.S. forces. Her actions under extreme duress saved dozens of American lives. Sarah shot him a look that was part gratitude and part embarrassment. She hadn't wanted to discuss her actions during captivity, but she understood why the colonel felt it was important for the soldiers to know. The physical wounds from my captivity healed relatively quickly, Sarah continued, but the psychological impact was more challenging. I developed PTSD, which is why I'm no longer in active duty status. The nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety attacks made it impossible for me to continue operational service. Several soldiers exchanged glances. Mental health issues were still stigmatized in military culture, and Sarah's openness about her PTSD was both surprising and refreshing. "That's why I'm here with you today," she said. "I may not be able to serve in the field anymore, but I can use my experience to prepare others for the challenges they might face. Teaching you these skills gives meaning to everything I went through." Sergeant Thompson stood up. "Ma'am, on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank you for sharing that with us. And I want to apologize again for questioning your qualifications when you first walked in." Sarah smiled at him. "Sergeant, you had every right to question me. In fact, I would have been disappointed if you hadn't. A healthy skepticism toward authority is exactly the kind of thinking that will keep you alive in hostile territory." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand. "Ma'am, I recognize some of the symbols in your tattoo. I've served with special operations units, and I know that level of classification comes with serious restrictions. How much of this can you actually teach us?" "That's an excellent question," Sarah replied. "Obviously, I can't discuss specific missions or reveal classified techniques. But the survival skills, psychological resilience training, and basic escape and evasion methods I've shared today are all within the boundaries of what I'm authorized to teach." She gestured toward the whiteboard, where she had sketched various diagrams throughout the morning. "Everything we've covered today is designed to increase your chances of survival and successful mission completion. The specific applications will depend on your deployment location and mission parameters." Petty Officer O'Brien had been quiet for most of the session, but now he stood up with a serious expression. "Ma'am, I think I speak for everyone when I say that we're honored to learn from someone who has sacrificed so much for our country. Your service and survival are an inspiration to all of us." There was a spontaneous round of applause that started slowly but quickly spread throughout the room. The 180 soldiers who had begun the day skeptical and dismissive were now giving Sarah a standing ovation. Sarah felt tears threatening to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know. But remember, the real test isn't in this classroom. It's what you do with this knowledge when you're deployed and facing real challenges." Colonel Patterson stepped forward again. "I think it's appropriate to tell you that Instructor Martinez has been recommended for reassignment to active duty status. Pending psychological evaluation and medical clearance, she may be joining your unit for deployment." The announcement sent a wave of excitement through the assembled soldiers. The idea of serving alongside someone with Sarah's experience and qualifications was both thrilling and reassuring. Sarah looked surprised by the colonel's announcement. "Sir, I wasn't aware that decision had been made." "It was finalized this morning," Patterson replied. "Your performance today has convinced command that you're ready to return to operational status, if you choose to accept the assignment." Sarah stood silently for a moment, processing the implications of what he had said. The opportunity to return to active duty was something she had dreamed about during her darkest moments of recovery. But it also meant facing the demons that had forced her into training status in the first place. "I'll need some time to consider that decision, sir," she said finally. "Of course," Patterson nodded, "but know that these soldiers would be fortunate to have you leading them." As the formal assessment concluded and the soldiers began filing out of the room, many of them stopped to shake Sarah's hand or express their appreciation for her instruction. The young woman who had walked into the room in civilian clothes facing skepticism and doubt was leaving with the respect and admiration of 180 experienced warriors. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was among the last to leave. He approached Sarah with the expression of deep respect. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've served with operators before, and I recognize real courage when I see it. What you shared with us today took guts, and what you survived took even more. If you do deploy with us, we'll be honored to serve alongside you." As the room emptied, Sarah stood alone with Colonel Patterson. The morning had been more emotionally demanding than she had expected, but also more rewarding. She had faced 180 soldiers without her uniform, armed only with her knowledge and experience, and she had earned their respect on her own terms. "How do you feel about the possibility of returning to active duty?" Patterson asked. Sarah looked out the window at the training facility where she had spent the past 6 months rebuilding her confidence and purpose. "Terrified and excited in equal measure, sir, but I think I'm ready to find out what I'm really capable of." The commander smiled. "I think these soldiers are lucky to have you, uniform or no uniform. Today proved that real authority comes from competence and character. Not from the clothes you wear or the rank on your collar. Sarah nodded, finally understanding that her journey from skepticism to respect in that room had been about more than proving her qualifications to others. It had been about proving